Sponsored by New Orleans Distillers, creators of fine spirits and liqueurs. Through dedication to science, art, and passion, blends of tradition and flavor emerge. For you, always locally crafted. New Orleans Distillers, classically Southern.
Tonight, Joe Biden and senators reach a deal on infrastructure. The Teamsters vote to support Amazon workers to unionize. And the former White House Chief of Staff and Director of OMB sounds off. That and more tonight, all on Wall Street Wrap-Up. Hi, welcome to Wall Street Wrap-Up. I hope your week went well. I'm Andre Laborde. Our goal is bringing Wall Street to your street for today, Friday, June the 25th, 2021, and to get you ready for the events ahead for next week. We've got a great show for you this evening, so stick around. We'll be talking with the former White House Chief of Staff for President Donald Trump, Mick Mulvaney. In addition to being Chief of Staff, Mick was also Director of OMB, Office of Management and Budget. Will the debt ceiling be raised this summer? How about Joe Biden? He wants a $6 trillion budget. And last week, President Biden met with Vladimir Putin in Geneva. We've got so much to discuss, and that'll be with Mick Mulvaney in just a minute. But first, how did the markets do this week? The Dow Jones Industrial Average ended the week at 34,434. That was up 238 points for the day and up over 3.5 points for the week. And the S&P 500 closed today at 4,280, up 14 points for the day and up 2.75% for the week. And finally, the NASDAQ. They finished the week at 14,360, down 9.3 points for the day and up about 2.3% for the week. The S&P 500 posted a record close and also had its biggest week since February. And Bitcoin, well, they dropped $2,700 today to just over $32,000, and it dropped about 9.5% for the week. Well, my guest this evening, he's been in Congress representing South Carolina as a House of Representatives, then moving to the executive branch as the Director of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and the Director of Office of Management and Budget, and then as Chief of Staff to President Donald Trump. And he's here with us tonight. Hi, Mick. Welcome to Wall Street Wrap-Up.
Thanks very much for having me.
Joe Biden was in Geneva with the summit with Vladimir Putin. Was it like a 3-0 for Vladimir Putin? To this aspect, I mean, the Biden administration canceled the XL Keystone pipeline, the Nord Stream pipeline through Europe that was to be supplying oil from Russia to Europe was allowed to go forth. Our Colony pipeline in United States was stopped because of hackers from Russia. May not have been with the explicitness of Vladimir Putin, but it was still. So I'm curious, was this a win-win, this summit for Putin, or did we come out with it anything?
I don't know if that's the right way to look at it. I guess you could look at it that way. I look at it this way, which is that I think Putin is much happier to have Joe Biden around than he was Donald Trump. For exactly the reasons you just mentioned. People don't understand, I don't think, that energy policy, probably more than any other single domestic policy, has impacts overseas in ways that most domestic policies don't. Energy policy is not only energy policy, it's economic policy, and it is foreign policy. And for the reasons you just laid out, Joe Biden sort of did give Russia a bunch of wins. Trump had cracked down on Nord Stream 2. Biden undid that. Trump had approved the XL pipeline, and Biden undid that. The Colonial Pipeline thing, the hack is a little bit different, but the unilateral actions of the Biden administration on XL and on Nord Stream were unequivocally really, really good for Russia. Now, I've heard a lot of people say, well, we're actually doing this as a favor to the Germans. No, the thing we could have done that would have helped Germany the most is figure out a way to export our liquefied natural gas to Europe instead of making them rely on Russia. We have the ability to do it. All that we lack is the will, and that's the political will. And there again, the Biden team failed at that level. So in so many ways this week, I don't know if I call it 3-0, 4-0, 5-1, not keeping score. I'm just saying that I have to think that Vladimir Putin is sitting back after this week and saying, you know what, it's a pretty good week for me.
16 critical infrastructures that's highly classified. Do you think that it was true that he told Putin that the 16 critical infrastructure areas were hands off? And does that also mean that the 17th on down is okay? Is okay to use to
Is
go
hands
after?
on?
Hands
Yeah,
on?
I don't know. Keep in mind, yeah, if it's number 17, is it hands on? I don't know. That's an interesting question. I don't worry too much about what the president says when he's in those meetings. I care about the actions. He can say all he wants to. There's going to be a red line on these 15 things, or 16 things, or 24 things. But the real test is going to be, okay, what happens when Russia crosses that red line? The Biden Obama administration does not have a very good track record on dealing with red lines with the Russians, going back now to the use of chemical weapons in Syria.
Should Ukraine be uncomfortable right now?
Well, Ukraine should be uncomfortable anyway. It's been a very difficult several years there. In fact, there's another country that I think probably was sad to see Donald Trump go. By the way, it went without much fanfare this week that the Biden administration withheld some funding for the Ukraine because of corruption. That sounds familiar to me. And keep in mind, it was the Trump administration that started actually sending lethal assistance to the Ukrainians, something the Obama administration did not do. And I'm not aware of the Biden administration doing it yet. I could be wrong on that.
There was a new president-elect in Iran. Now that a hardliner has just been elected president-elect of Iran, will that sit very well with upcoming negotiations with us?
Sure, I think it will with the Biden administration. It will. They'll talk. They for some reason, and I don't understand why. Whether it's hubris, and they really believe they can convince the Iranians to do the right thing, or if the Iranians are just misguided and somehow the Biden team is so intelligent and so wonderful that they're going to convince the Iranians that it's in their best interest to stop this nuclear program. That same sort of hubris that led to the Iranian agreement in the first place. I hope that's not the case, but it's the one thing that sort of explains the facts. Iran hated the fact that we pulled out of the agreement. They hated the impact of that. The impact on their economy was dramatic and continues to be. They would love to get back into those so-called negotiations and get rid of the various sanctions as part of it.
I think it was George Shultz, former Treasury Secretary for Ronald Reagan, said, and I think he said, an economist's lag is a politician's nightmare. In other words, that politicians like things just and you were in the legislative branch, you've been in the executive branch, so you know how, as a congressman, you're up for election every 2 years. So, but when it comes to the Federal Reserve, sometimes this may take 3 quarters, 4 quarters to be able to turn a battleship. Are you happy with Jay Powell, the way the head of the chairman of the Federal Reserve, in keeping interest rates as low as they're doing right now? And I'll also throw in, while you're answering, I'll also throw in the bond market purchases of $120 billion a month.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of really good issues about the Federal Reserve, which supposedly is independent. I keep hearkening back to the fact that Janet Yellen, who used to be the Fed chairwoman, we used to call her before the House Financial Services all the time and accuse her of doing the Democrats' work, and she kept committing up and down that she was independent. Now she's the politically appointed Treasury Secretary. So I don't know why folks don't pay more attention to the fact that the Fed is politicized. There's no question about it. The Fed is now talking about things like equity and racial justice. The last time I checked, the Fed had 2 statutory mandates. Number 1, stable prices. Number 2, full employment. And they're supposed to do that with only monetary policy. So anytime you get a Fed that talks outside of those lanes, you get a Fed that is breaking the law, in my mind, and certainly sending mixed messages to the market that they might be willing to do things that are above and beyond their legal statutory authority. Inflation is too much money chasing too few goods. If you have all other things being equal, more money pumped into a system and fewer things to buy, the price of those things will go up. That is what inflation is. And on the policy standpoint, the fiscal policies of the Biden administration has been to spend a bunch of money, which pumps a bunch of money into the system. So there's half of the inflationary equation. On the other side, they're making it harder to bring things to market. For example, by canceling the XL pipeline, by canceling oil drilling on public lands, by trying to use the Endangered Species Act to prevent fracking. They're making it more difficult to bring things to market. So more money, fewer things, more inflation. None of that has anything to do with the Fed. However, is the Fed contributing to it by keeping those interest rates down? Absolutely. You're already starting to hear that some voices within the Fed say they won't be able to wait to 2023 to raise interest rates. They might have to do it sooner. I think that's simply sound policy.
Jay Powell is up for renomination next year. And Washington, D.C. is a very political town. Do you think that a lot of his decisions are maybe even subconsciously based on he wants to get renominated again for another, 6-year term?
Yeah, I don't know Jay well enough to sort of get into his psyche. I do know that one of the things that most officials in Washington want to do is remain an official in Washington. It's a pretty good lifestyle. There's only one thing better, I think, than being rich in the world, and that's being rich and famous. And, folks like being rich and famous. And it's really, really hard to give it up and go back to being whatever you do after you are the Federal Reserve Chairman. I have no idea what Ben Bernanke is doing now. My guess is most people don't. So would it be human in nature to want to stay in the spotlight? Absolutely. Does that mean you might change your policies in order to be more accommodating to politicians? It's certainly possible. That topic comes up with every single Fed chairman going back as far as people can remember. Paul Volcker was accused of doing a lot of the same things.
I'm reminded what Henry Kissinger one time said: "Power is the greatest aphrodisiac." So, and when you're in Washington, D.C., it's so true. Mick, we're going to take a break right now. We'll be right back. Hi, welcome back. We're talking with Mick Mulvaney, former White House Chief of Staff, former Director of the Office of Management and Budget, talking about a variety of things. Right before leaving for our break, we were just talking about the Federal Reserve and whether or not they're going to be raising interest rates. Mick, help me out a little bit with the debt that we have right now. And our interest rates are between 0 and 25 basis points. Scratch that. Not between 0 and 0.25%. Okay, for every 0.25% that the Federal Reserve raises of interest rates, how much of the national debt do we have to pay on interest, especially right now when we're into the trillions?
Yeah, I haven't run the numbers in a while. I do know that when I was the director of the Office of Management and Budget and the debt was about 20 trillion, we were paying about $300 to $350 million a year in interest. So that's about 1.5 points. And if you owe $20 trillion and you get another 100 basis points, that's another $200 billion a year in interest payments. So it's a big, big number. And I think people have just now started, much too late in my opinion, worrying about the size of the interest payments. In fact, not enough people are even worried about it now. There's some folks who say it doesn't make any difference, and that you can borrow money infinitely. This is called, to a certain extent, modern monetary theory, that you can spend as much as you want as long as it doesn't have inflationary impact. Of course, we're starting to see now that it does have inflationary impact, which is exactly what orthodox economics would teach you. So no, I think if your point is this, it's well made, which is that the Federal Reserve might be slow to raise interest rates because they know the federal government can't afford to pay the debt.
You've read my thoughts. That's exactly what I'm thinking.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. The primary beneficiary of the zero interest rate universe right now is the federal government. They are the largest debtor in the world. Debtors love low rates. And if the Fed was to, you and I are old enough to remember when interest rates were 12, 14, 16%, we'd be bankrupt at that number. Keep in mind, that's the total receipts of the federal government are someplace about 3.5, maybe it's up to $4 trillion of receipts. But last time I checked, it's about $3.5 trillion worth of money coming in. If you owe $20 trillion and you're paying 10% interest, that's $2 trillion a year in just interest payments. So you can see how quickly it can add up. So I do think there's pressure internally on the Fed to be cautious about raising rates, because it puts tremendous strain on the federal balance sheet.
Right now, Joe Biden and the Biden administration is wanting to add another $6 trillion budget that I'm not sure that it'll pass through Congress, but it's their wish list of every type of thing that they want to put in. So you're looking at another $6 trillion or something, and we're talking with the T's. I mean, to kind of paraphrase former Senator Everett Dirksen, $1 trillion here and $1 trillion there, and pretty soon we're talking some real money for doing it.
Yeah, some part of me, I'm not big into banning language, so I say this mostly tongue in cheek, but I think it'd be interesting to ban the word trillion and make people actually say, if I want to spend $6 trillion, that's $6,000 billion. That's an unfathomable amount of money. And that's just on supposedly infrastructure that the Democrats are talking about now. Keep in mind, they also think that elder care, and I understand immigration is now infrastructure, that Senator Bernie Sanders wants to include immigration as part of an infrastructure bill. So really, when everything is infrastructure, nothing is infrastructure. This is just another spending bill. But yeah, they're talking about as much as another $6 trillion, none of it paid for. Everybody loves spending money in Washington, D.C., and that speaks to most Republicans as well. Everything right now that's being done in Washington is being done with borrowed money. And that's something that I think should worry more people than it does.
Joe Manchin, the senator from West Virginia, much better than we do. And he's saying that he's going to hold the line. He will not let go of the filibuster. He's also saying that he wants to preserve the Senate as far as like what reconciliation was when his predecessor, Robert Byrd, was the senator and such. Do you feel that he can withstand the pressure that I'm sure the other Democrats are putting on him?
I do, for a reason that I don't think gets a lot of attention, which is it's not just him. He's not the only one who doesn't want to see the filibuster go away. There are some Democrats who don't want to see it. I pressured Republicans to get rid of it when I was chief of staff, or at least to reform it, to make it harder to use. And those Republicans didn't want to get rid of it when we were in control of the House and the Senate and the White House, as the Democrats are now. The Senate as an institution loves the filibuster. Why is that? Because it makes everybody important, even if you're in the minority. If you're in the House, and I've been in the House, and you're in the minority, you're pretty worthless. You just are. Things can happen without you. You don't have, you pretty much sit around and take instructions from the majority on when to show up and what to vote on, and then you just vote against whatever the majority is doing. And the Senate is different, and senators like it that way. And it's that way in part because of the filibuster. There are many Democrat senators beyond Joe Manchin who know that being in the minority is no more than the next midterm elections away. They think they're going to they'll gain seats in 2022, but it's quite possible that they will not. And then they will be back in the minority and they will want the filibuster. So it's really an institutional thing. It's not Republican versus Democrat. I think if you put it to a secret ballot of senators, maybe senators who were no longer even still in the place, would they still want to do the filibuster? The majority might even say yes, because they like the authority and the power it gives them as individuals, even if they're in the minority.
I understand. When you were talking about the difference between the House and the Senate, I'm reminded of former President Lyndon Johnson one time said, I've been in the House and I've been in the Senate, and both of them are fine, great bodies. But the difference between the House and the Senate is the difference between chicken salad and another kind of chicken. So I guess that kind of sums it up pretty well as far as like where you can, you're one of 435 members as compared to one of 100. And it's certainly a,
Yeah, I remember joking with the president because I came out of the House and so did Mike Pence, and we are hardcore sort of supporters of the House of Representatives, and there's a great deal of institutional strain between the House and the House of Lords, as we call them, on the other side. And I remember one time talking to the president using that famous line, and I think it may have been attributable to Johnson, although my history is not as good as yours, when someone asked him about dealing with the enemy in terms of the Republicans, and he said, "Sir, the Republicans are the opposition. The enemy is the Senate." And I think that probably speaks great deals about the institutional sort of tension that exists, and rightly so. The Founding Fathers wanted it. They wanted some tension. It's part of the check and balance. I'm okay with it. The filibuster as it exists today is not what has existed historically. You used to have to speak a filibuster. I think that would be a tremendous compromise. If you really, really don't like a piece of legislation, you want to shut down the Senate, you should have the right to do that. You shouldn't be able to sign a piece of paper and go to dinner for a fundraiser and shut down the business of the Senate. But again, I know I'm in the minority on that front, and that's someone with a bias in favor of the House.
I think people will be pulling out the old movie Mr. Smith Goes to Washington to see exactly what the heck of the old-time filibuster was, of having to stand up on your feet and just keep talking and talking. The Biden administration said was that he does not want to put any taxes on anybody making under $400,000. But one of the things on the table was the gasoline tax, that right now it's being depleted. Do you see that the Congress is going to be adding more to the gasoline tax to help with roads?
No, I don't, because it's too easy to call it a tax. What Congress is going to do, and what Congress is doing, the Democrats are doing this with eyes wide open. They are taxing the middle class. They are taxing the lower class. They're taxing seniors. They're taxing everybody who makes under $400,000 a year right now with inflation. That's what inflation is. Inflation is a tax that politicians don't have to vote for. They can blame it on somebody else. But when you had when your $100 could buy $100 worth of stuff yesterday and $90 worth of stuff tomorrow, what's the difference between that and a $10 tax? It lowers your ability to buy things. It lowers your purchasing power, the value of your personal wealth. That's what inflation is. It's a tax on everybody. In fact, it falls disproportionately on the poor and the middle class, the people the Democrats say they're trying to help, and actually can help a lot of the richest amongst us, the people the Democrats say they want to soak, because those are folks who already own assets. If you own a company or you own a piece of land or a giant home, inflation actually makes that asset that you already own more valuable. So it can actually, in a roundabout sort of way, help the richest among us and hurt the poorest. But you don't have to vote for it. And you can always blame it on somebody else. You can blame it on another factor. You can say, I didn't vote for that. I didn't vote to raise your taxes. Reelect me. And politicians of both parties hate to vote to raise taxes on just about everybody. Democrats are okay with doing it on people they consider to be wealthy. That never raises enough money to have a meaningful impact on the fiscal situation in our country and the financial situation. It's mostly done for politics so they can go back to their supporters in the lower middle classes and say, vote for me again and I'll soak the rich again.
One of the reforms that the Democrat side of the House wanted was the reforming of the IRS, to add more IRS agents. Do you think that's going to pass?
I think it might, for the reasons I'll explain. So you raised two different things in the IRS. Real quickly, because I know we don't have much time left, is the politicization of the IRS does concern me. The fact that now tax returns are being leaked out, apparently from the IRS. Yeah, go back to Lois Lerner. That's right. But even today, that things are leaking out that sort of feed the Democrat narrative. The deep state is real. It's not pervasive. It's not everybody, but it doesn't take a lot. It can take 0.1% of the federal workforce to undermine or to promote any particular administration, which is not what we want in an elected democracy. We want our elected officials to make these decisions, not unelected bureaucrats. So the politics of that is concerning to me. The reason I think it might pass is that it's easy. Is there a certain increase you might get if you give the IRS a little bit more money? Probably. Could you fix the IRS by making it more efficient? Yes, you could, but you're not going to solve the nation's economic woes, and you're certainly not going to pay for your $6 trillion quasi-infrastructure bill by IRS reforms. That's pipe dreams. That's the kind of stuff that politicians say so they can tell people they've done the right thing, but it's not accurate. It doesn't exist in the real world.
Well, I hope you come back. We've got a lot more to talk about.
Thanks very much. Good to be here.
My thanks to former Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney. Thank you, Mick. Well, the 4th of July is just a few days away, and people, after a year of being locked down, well, they're just itching to get out of the house. The top cities for people traveling this 4th of July are Seattle, Washington, Las Vegas, Nevada, and Denver, Colorado, Anaheim, California, and the #1 destination that they want to go to, Orlando, Florida. I've got a feeling Disneyland and Disney World will be two of the destinations on the first and second destinations that people will be going to this 4th of July. Well, if you've got a question about finance or a comment about the show, we'd love to hear from you. You can write us at andre@wallstreetwrapup.info. Keep it pithy or concise. We'll be glad to answer your questions. And now for a look ahead for next week. But first, On this day, what classic American car with the famous slogan, "Ask the man that owns one," last rolled off the Detroit assembly line? What car is it? Well, we'll have the answer in just a moment. On this day, what classic American car with the famous slogan, "Ask the man that owns one," last rolled off the Detroit assembly line? What car was it? It was the Packard. The last Packard rolled off the assembly line on this day, June the 25th, 1956. And in other business news this week, Warren Buffett has resigned as trustee for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation as the charity grapples with an upheaval created by the divorce of its namesake founders, Bill and Melinda Gates. Warren Buffett has contributed more than $27 billion of his own money to the charity over the past 15 years. In June of 2006, he owned 478,000 shares of Berkshire Hathaway. Now he owns just over 238,000 shares, worth about $100 billion. Warren Buffett said, "Please understand that this is no swan song," but he says he's clearly playing in the fourth quarter of the game that's just gone into overtime. Well, this past February 26th, our guest was former president of Shell Oil, John Hofmeister. John never shied away from any uncomfortable question about the oil and gas industry. His openness to discussion set him up for tricky questions. In fact, in 2006, while being interviewed by Katie Couric of NBC, she asked him on the air if he could feel the pain that consumers were feeling and whether he might unilaterally decrease the wholesale value of gasoline. John was ready with an answer. He said, "Katie, we do feel the pain. All of our employees pay the same price that every other consumer pays for gas." But he added, "The markets set the price." In 2010, he wrote a book called "Why We Hate Oil Companies," straight from an energy insider. He said politicians make the industry a scapegoat for their own failures in energy policy. John and I talked a number of times both before and after our February 26th show, and when I had an oil and gas question, nothing like going to the former president of Shell for an answer. He was always nice, informative, and best of all, he was enjoyable to talk to. John, who was under treatment for melanoma, died last week in Houston, Texas. John Hofmeister was 73 years old. Well, join me next week when our guest will be Chris Fenton. Chris has been part of the Hollywood community as a producer and studio executive for over 21 major motion pictures. And Chris has written a book called Feeding the Dragon. Now, not only Hollywood movies, but companies as Nike, Apple, Google, and the NBA are doing whatever China is asking to get into their market. It's a fascinating book on how China is dictating its demands and businesses are agreeing to those terms. China is now calling the shots. Chris Fenton will be with us next week, and I'm looking forward to it. Well, that's our show. Hope you've enjoyed it for Friday, February 25th, 2021. Remember, you can always follow us on Facebook and WYES.org. So thank you for joining us and allowing us into your homes tonight. Have a great weekend and an even better week ahead. I'll see you next week for Wall Street Wrap-Up. I'm Andre Laborde. Remember, money never sleeps. Good night.
Sponsored by New Orleans Distillers, creators of fine spirits and liqueurs. Through dedication to science, art, and passion, blends of tradition and flavor emerge. For you, always locally crafted. New Orleans Distillers, classically Southern.